The BSides DC 2016 videos are brought to you by clearedjobs.net and cybersecjobs.com, tools for your next career move, and Antietam Technologies, focusing on advanced cyber detection, analysis, and mitigation.
Okay, so before we get started, I'm Sean Metcalf. I've started a new tradition at DerbyCon where I actually give away puppies before my talk. So I have some puppies here. I'm going to ask some PowerShell questions. Who created PowerShell? Raise your hand if you have an answer. No one knows who created PowerShell? Jeff Stover, there you go. Oh, it was so close. Okay, what was the original code name for PowerShell? Raise your hand, I don't know where you are. Modad. There you go. Puppies. Okay. What is the default file extension for a PowerShell script? Hands. Sorry, I saw his hand first. What is my favorite PowerShell post-exploitation tool written by Varus? Raise your hand. There you go. What is the new hotness from Varus that does recon and Active Directory that leverages PowerShell to pull that data? There you go. That's it for the puppies. Thank you. Wow, even with video problems, it still worked out pretty good. So, are we good on video? I'm going to be over here. Is that fine? Okay, let's get this out of the way. So this is PowerShell Security defending the enterprise from the latest attack platform, and I am Sean Metcalf, and since it's 1:30, we're going to get started. So I'm the founder of Trimark, a security company, Microsoft certified master in Active Directory, one of about 100 in the world, and a Microsoft MVP as of earlier this year. I've spoken at a number of different conferences. This is my first time speaking at BSides DC. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a security consultant and a researcher, and I own and operate 80security.org, which hopefully many of you have been to and have checked out. Also, at one point in time, I raced armadillos. Long story. So PowerShell, what are we talking about with this? What is PowerShell? I think most people here know what PowerShell is. But we're going to cover very briefly some cool things about PowerShell, what its capability is. We're going to talk about how it's used as an attack platform, look at some real-world attack code that I found on the internet, because everything on the internet's cool and awesome. And we're going to talk about how all of these new PowerShell security features are often bypassed by attackers. So isn't PowerShell just C# with training wheels? Well, kind of. Yes, it absolutely is. I posed this question to Matt Graber, and he kind of just turned around and walked away from me. Which makes sense, because apparently the squirrel doesn't know how to ride a tricycle, so that's how it goes. But PowerShell is an object-based scripting language which leverages .NET. Originally written and designed in C#, it has tremendous capability. It has basic connectivity and ability to pull data from disparate data sources, like the registry, the event log, WMI, XML. And so the power of it is the fact that you don't have to write your own parsers for a lot of this. You can just natively pull in data from XML and work with it. You can extend the PowerShell capability, the commandlets that are available on the box, by importing command modules, which then provide a whole lot of additional commandlets which are purpose-built and specific to a specific purpose or area or command or data gathering session that you need or you want. And it's almost 10 years old now. In fact, next month, PowerShell will be 10 years old. And here I am talking about it in DC. It's pretty exciting. So with PowerShell version 5, we get a lot of nice security enhancements. PowerShell version 5, of course, came out early this year. Technically, it came out in December of last year, but we're not talking about that. It came out this year. And we get some really great features. Script lock logging, system-wide transcripts, constrained PowerShell that locks down PowerShell when you have application whitelisting enabled, like AppLocker or Device Guard, and anti-malware integration with Windows 10. We can configure these settings, we can configure these security through group policy. And there's a number of different settings and options that we have here. All this group policy is doing is setting items in the registry. And I'm sorry, it's very difficult to see, but that's the registry, those are the settings. We just nod and smile, we move on. Script lock logging we can enable through the group policy. And basically, script block logging takes that PowerShell code that's delivered to the PowerShell engine, and effectively, just before it's executed, it's logged. So with module logging, the type of logging we have in PowerShell in version 3 and version 4, and also in 5, what that gives us is whatever code is delivered to the engine is what gets logged. Well, there's a problem with that, because if that code is obfuscated, if it's munged around in such a way that it doesn't look like language, it doesn't look clear to us, it makes it very difficult to identify what's going on. With script block logging, we can actually get what PowerShell interprets and what it's about to run in order to look at that and create indicators. So we want to turn that on. Because if someone is running an encoded command or doing some obfuscation, in this event, we're actually going to see that someone's running Invoke-Mimikatz. Another nice feature, system-wide transcript. So in PowerShell, we've had the ability to have a transcript, which is a file that gets written when you tell it to tell PowerShell, go ahead and write a file for me and say, show everything that shows up in the console. The system-wide transcript is something that once enabled, you can point it to a share on the network. Make it a write once share, so that way that file is written there and cannot be modified. And it's written anytime any user on that system opens up the PowerShell console or does something in PowerShell. And it's effectively an over-the-shoulder transcript of what they're doing. So you can go back to that and look at that later and go, oh, that looks like PowerShell Empire. That looks interesting. And this is what it looks like. So we've got a lot of really good information at the top. Start time, the username, who it was run as, the machine it's on, the host application, if it's PowerShell.exe or maybe it's something else, the version of PowerShell, et cetera. And we can see that Mimikatz is running on this, which looks a little suspicious. The enforced PowerShell constrained language mode locks down PowerShell to its core components. So we can't run those advanced features that Invoke-Mimikatz loves using, like calling Windows APIs, calling .NET, etc. And this locks down with App Locker or Device Guard once you have that in enforced mode. So this means that these more advanced scripts, such as those that are in PowerSploit, like Invoke-Mimikatz or the get keystrokes, which is a keystroke logger within PowerShell, or even just dumping a process from PowerSploit, all of those get blocked because those advanced functionality get blocked. And if we run Mimikatz, even if we're downloading it, executing it in memory, it still gets blocked because constrained language mode says, I don't know what you're trying to do. Only core types are available. And in Windows 10, we get the AMSI, which is the anti-malware scan interface. This is a big step up with Windows 10. Traditional antivirus can only see and scan files if they hit disk. If they don't hit disk, they have no idea what's going on. So what does this mean? If I download and execute Invoke-Mimikatz in memory without it ever touching disk, antivirus can't do anything about it. But with Windows 10 and the AMSI, assuming that I have a registered anti-malware solution with AMSI, like Windows Defender, PowerShell, once it gets that code, is going to kick it through the AMSI to whatever that registered anti-malware is and check it and send back a status OK. PowerShell will run it. The same thing happens for VBScript and other Windows scripting hosts and engines on that system. So now we can get more insight into what's going on from a scripting perspective on our Windows boxes. And this is what it looks like. So if I download and execute that code in memory, it's going to get stopped, assuming that it's flagged as malicious. And what's interesting about this, if you look at the file path, it's actually triggering on PowerShell.exe. Does anyone think the PowerShell.exe is really malicious? No, it's not. What happens is when you download that code and jam it into memory and execute it from memory, it's not a file, right? It doesn't have a place on the hard drive that it can reference. So there's effectively a virtual address that gets added, or virtual file that gets added to PowerShell.exe here, and that's how it tracks it. And we can see that here when we're looking at a couple of the PowerShell commandlets that will give us more information about threats that are detected by Defender. And in the top, you can see that I was trying to copy a renamed Invoke-Mimikatz file to another named Invoke-Mimikatz file, and it flagged it as a threat. It said, that looks bad, I'm not going to let that happen. And it stopped the copy. The second one was actually pulling that code from the internet, injecting it in memory, and then executing it. And you can see that it says PowerShell.exe underscore 10.0 and then .00000. That's the virtual file that it flags. But it's not 100%. So as with all new technology, there's some issues. Sometimes PowerShell code does get through. DLL hijacking. So the guy who wrote PowerShell, which is a PowerShell offensive toolkit in a single executable, he realized that if you drop that executable on the box, PowerShell on a box, into a location, and then added his own version of AMSI.dll, effectively hijacking that DLL, then it would go, when AMSI would get called, it would go to that version. And his version would say, everything's good. So it wouldn't cause any problems. But Matt Graber actually figured out that he could tell AMSI from within PowerShell that everything's fine using reflection, and it would just work with everything. And so this fits in a tweet, which just amazes me, because he was able to get this code that bypasses AMSI into 140 characters. So I mentioned that sometimes PowerShell code just works and gets through. This is me testing Invoke-Mimikatz, downloading it from the internet and executing it. And you see Windows Defender actually popped up and flagged on it. But it still ran because I still got credentials from that system. So it's still being worked on. And the other problem is that there's only 3 vendors today that support it, which is kind of a mega fail because Windows 10 has been out for a year. So we're looking at Defender, AVG, and an ESET beta version. And then all the others, they have no statement on AMSI. So please ask your vendor to support AMSI in Windows 10. So it's story time with Sean. There's a kid's story called A Fish Out of Water. I remember this when I was a kid. I love this story. And basically, it's about a little kid that gets a goldfish. And he takes it home. And he didn't listen to Mr. Carp, who said, you know what? Give the fish this much and no more. Or something may happen, you never know what. Okay, Sean, what does this have to do with PowerShell? So Microsoft with PowerShell version 5 has a new feature component security enhancement called Just Enough Administration. So the principle of least privilege says just this much of rights, of permissions, of access, and nothing more. Or something may happen, you never know what. I think we know what happens when someone has more access than they're supposed to. But G is available with PowerShell version 5, Windows 10, Windows 2016. And effectively with GIA, we get a constrained PowerShell remoting session with whitelisted commandlets. So we specifically say these are the commandlets that are allowed, and specific parameters that are allowed with names of those parameters and actual parameter values that are allowed. And this is baked into Windows 10 and 2016. Otherwise, you can install PowerShell version 5 and configure GIA on other systems, supported systems like Windows 7, 2008 R2. But what's really interesting is you can when you delegate server rights, it can leverage a virtual account on that system, assuming that you're using GIA on a supported platform for that, which actually abstracts the credentials that are being used for it even more. And we can gain insight into what those activities are through PowerShell logging and transcription, which we don't really get when someone's using RDP or using an MMC or using another tool. But we can get that if we can identify what those tasks are and actually PowerShell those tasks, which is ideal for server admin delegation. If your server admins really just need to connect into a box and restart a service, or maybe clear the event log, or save the event log, or do a few other things, why do they need to be able to RDP in as an admin? So configuring GIA is something that sounds like it could work, right? But there's a number of things that we have to do. And we need to make sure we have prerequisites, which domain join, PowerShell remoting is enabled, GIA supported, etc. But the second one is really the most important. How many people actually know what the admins are doing, what their rights are, what their rights that they actually are required to do? So if I'm an admin, I might get domain admin. Why? It's easier. I say I need to do these things. Okay, domain admin, go ahead and do that. I don't need domain admin. I could just do this. No, that's fine. Just use that. That's easier. We need to start identifying what admins really need to do, because then we can start leveraging technology like this and make sure that admins have this much and no more. So we identify the tasks, we restrict as appropriate, we confirm they work with GIA because they have to be PowerShell commandlets and it actually needs to plug in correctly. We can configure these identified tasks in a role capability file, PSRC, And then we're going to register a session configuration which exposes that role capability. And we need to make sure that we follow principle of least privilege. But of course, the important thing here is that we test that. So if we just go ahead and configure GIA for a bunch of admins and we say, go ahead and do this PowerShell remote in, we actually may be opening up another avenue of attack for something else. So we definitely need to look at this. But this is a great capability and it's a great feature, and it's something we need to look at and start getting away from having admins RDP in the systems all the time, when maybe we can give them a customized PowerShell script that they can run and more easily manage all of the systems they have to, giving them back more time. So PowerShell obviously is very helpful as an attack platform. Meant for administrators, but like all good admin tools, can be used for more nefarious purposes. But attackers have options, so it's not just about PowerShell. Attackers have always had options. Custom executables, Windows command tools, RDP, Windows scripting. This is just another tool in their toolkit. Python even. Well, how did we get to the point where we are now? In the summer of 2010, about 6 years ago, Dave Kennedy and Josh Kelly presented at DEF CON OMFG, PowerShell, like what, this is crazy, all this stuff I can do. And they described in that talk, which I highly recommend you check out, most, if not all, of the PowerShell attack techniques we see today. Bypass execution policy, encoded commands, invoke expression. And they released a tool that dumped the SAM database on the Windows box with a PowerShell-based tool, entirely built in PowerShell. By the way, all these slides will be available now on AD Security, so just so you know. And in 2012, just a couple years later, Matt Graber released PowerSploit, a GitHub repo with a number of PowerShell attack tools, which started with Invoke shellcode. He realized that you could take PowerShell code and inject them into the process you're choosing. And originally, this was from an interpreter, but it could be used for just about any shellcode. And then a year later, the shot heard around the world was when Invoke-Mimikatz was released by Joe Balick. And now Mimikatz was no longer just an executable you had to control. Now it's a PowerShell script you need to stop from downloading from the internet, from people carrying around, from Casey Smith putting into an image file. And this leverages Invoke Reflection PE injection, which just blows my mind. You can take a DLL file, encode it into a PowerShell script, which is a text file, and run that and push that into memory, push that code into memory, that DLL, and then call it in memory without anything ever touching disk. So PowerShell, very beneficial for the admin. Lots of capability. Can run lots of different types of things. Can call Windows APIs. But there's a lot of things that attackers love about it. The things that admins love about it, attackers love also. And the interesting thing is that historically, most organizations haven't had good visibility into PowerShell. It's gotten much better. But this is another reason why attackers like to use it. So let's talk about real-world PowerShell attacks. Yeah, that'd be great. So like I said, I found a lot of things off the internet. I also reached out to some people in the industry and said, hey, send me your PowerShell attack code. I'll use it for good, I promise. So I'm putting it up here. We're using it for good as education. So as we know, macros are code that run in documents. VBA, Visual Basic for applications. When you click on Enable Macro, we know that's running code. Unfortunately, it's called Enable Macros, and people see that as, I need to see the stuff that's in this file, right? But this is what actually runs behind the scenes. And this is interesting because this word macro calls PowerShell. It has OBJ process create power in quotes and shell in quotes and .exe in quotes, execution policy bypass, etc. And then it's downloading some stuff from the internet and then executing it. Pretty standard, but interesting way to do it from a word macro. And then we also see that another one can download code and upload recon data. So there's a number of different variables here that are key to what that system is and how it's configured, which then get uploaded right back again. So pull the code down, execute it, pull some recon off the system, and then upload it to the system of their choice. Download code and execute. So the first one here, and I'm sorry the people in the back is a little more difficult to see. We haven't expanded here. Invoke shellcode is being executed on this system to obviously inject some shellcode. And then some additional things are done here to get some additional payloads. So a lot of times, malware authors use stagers, right? Use one part to use then go to another part to do another part. Makes it a little more difficult to track. This one I really love. So the first one pulls an executable off of a website and then drops it locally and executes it in C users, app data roaming, which is why it's a good idea to actually block users from running executable content from these locations. But the second one is really interesting because it's pulling down a JPEG and then renaming it as an executable. So on the internet it's .jpg, but locally it's .exe. This one I love. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new task on this system. We're going to call it Update Google, but really it's going to just run some PowerShell. And so it's running invoke shellcode. And that means that we're going to get some stuff that the system administrator is not expecting to be on that system. And then as we look and dig into it, we see DLL import kernel32.dll, which is something attackers love using because it gives a lot more functionality to their PowerShell script. And then they can do additional things like jam in more shellcode or do pretty much whatever they want. This is fascinating because this PowerShell script actually monitors what windows are open and then looks for specific financial and sensitive information in these windows, like LastPass, PayPal, Discover, Expedia, interesting things. And when it sees it, then it starts extracting information from those sites and has a keylogger component that's logging what is typed in. We can also take screenshots with PowerShell on a regular basis to screenshot what's going on and get more information about what the users are doing or the admin is doing. And last year at Black Hat, Matt Graber talked about WMI as a backdoor, as a great persistence method and mechanism. Well, we have Windows schedule tasks, but there's also this management interface buried into Windows called WMI that's been around for 20 years. And what is that? It basically provides, for valid reasons, but also for attackers, a way to set up a schedule task that you really can't find unless you write some PowerShell code. It's very difficult to get this because what you do is you actually configure this WMI task in several different parts. The first part is to say when this situation occurs. And then the other part is, I want you to do this. And then the third part is say, when you see this, then do this. And here, it's going to run evil.exe, which I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty suspicious. So what does Microsoft think about all this? And again, I apologize for the screen. What does Microsoft think about all this? At DerbyCon last month, Jeffrey Snover created PowerShell. Lee Holmes, who actually wrote all of these PowerShell version 5 security features, had keynoted at DerbyCon. And they said, well, we know that attackers are using PowerShell for attacks, but they're also using RDP, they're also using MMC, they're also using all these other tools that are there for admins. So they put up here and said, we know you have your choice of post-exploitation languages, so we thank you for hacking with PowerShell. But we don't just need PowerShell.exe. We can execute PowerShell from other places. And why is that? We can execute and run PowerShell from .NET because PowerShell is system.management.automation.dll. It is a DLL. It is not PowerShell.exe. It's not PowerShell_ISE.exe. Those are just consoles that call that DLL. In the right side, you can't really see it, but this is code from MSDN that says how to actually create an application that calls PowerShell code. And it's simple as going PowerShell PS equals PowerShell.create and then parens. And Ben 10, who spoke at DerbyCon this year and also last year, talked about his not PowerShell, which is an executable that's totally not PowerShell, but you can actually run PowerShell code from it. So we can create a C# application that references this DLL. We can leverage that automation assembly's functions to execute the PowerShell code. And this is pretty much how PowerShell.exe works. So Lee Christensen, someone said, hey, this is how this works and we do it this way. And he goes, well, what about over here? And they said, no, that doesn't really work that way. And he's like, okay. And he went off for like a month and figured out how to do it. So he wrote unmanaged PowerShell, which is the foundation for just about every attack tool that's out there that runs PowerShell code on a system without actually calling PowerShell.exe. How does it do this? It starts up .NET and performs in-memory loading of a custom C# assembly that executes that PowerShell and it runs it from an unmanaged process. Metasploit uses it as of March of this year, unmanaged PowerShell. Tremendously enhance the capability of Metasploit, because that means that they can do a lot of things that they couldn't otherwise do unless they were calling PowerShell.exe. So how do we sidestep PowerShell security? Man, that's too bad. So this is a graphic of a road in the middle with a gate there. And you can see in the snow that all these other cars have just gone right around that road because they can just drive in the grass, and there's a gate in the middle. So it's not so effective when you have to explain your graphics. So let's talk about PowerShell without PowerShell. One of my favorite, actually I can't say favorite because Jared has quoted me on that. This is not my favorite PowerShell attack tool that is an executable that's not PowerShell. I like to explain it because it's one of the easier ways to explain how this works. It is a self-contained custom executable that has PowerShell offensive attack code inside of it that can be leveraged just by running that executable. And it calls this PowerShell components through .NET. But what's pretty cool about it is all these PowerShell modules inside of this executable are encrypted. And when you run the executable, these are decrypted and then placed in the memory. So this means that antivirus really never gets a chance to see what the code really is, because they're encrypted in the executable, in that file. And then when it's executed, they're shoved up into memory. So this is pretty interesting. You run PS attack, it decrypts these modules into memory. And we can run a commandlet within PS attack called get attack. If we want to do recon, we say get attack recon, or get attack netcat, or get attack passwords to see what's available to us. So here's the interesting thing about PS attack. When I run PS attack and run Invoke-Mimikatz, there is no PowerShell.exe that's executing. It's PS attack. If I rename it or call it something else, then that's what would show up. What about constrained language mode, Sean? You said how great that is, how it can stop Invoke-Mimikatz. But I see Invoke-Mimikatz is running on the bottom when you run PS attack. Yes, that is true. So constrained language mode only constrains PowerShell.exe, the PowerShell console components. It does not constrain when you have an application, a .NET exe calling PowerShell code. You can bypass that constrained language mode. Sean, why did Microsoft do this? I asked that very question. And the answer I got was because of compatibility with other applications. You might have constrained language mode and that application would stop working, at which point they would blame Microsoft. Queue, support, hassles, small violin, etc. So Invoke-Mimikatz works in constrained language mode when it's called from this executable. And it doesn't show up in the task manager. Okay, that's interesting. It bypassed constrained language mode. How does it do that? Well, I mentioned how it does that. But is there anything else that it's doing that's unusual? What about all those great PowerShell version 5 security logs that I was talking about? They're not there. So I run Invoke-Mimikatz from within PowerShell PS attack, and there are no logs that show up in the PowerShell operational log. Why is this? It seems really weird. But there are the original PowerShell logs. So event ID 400, event ID 800, the ones you got with PowerShell like in the version 2 days, your default Windows 7 ones. How does this work? It works because PS attack is actually using PowerShell version 2 on that system. And these capabilities are not available in PowerShell 2. There is no script block logging. There is no module logging. So at the top here, I run from a command prompt PowerShell-version space 2. So I'm basically invoking, calling PowerShell, but I only want to use the version 2 libraries. They only want to use version 2 associated PowerShell. And I run a command called getProcess. You can't see it on the right side. I apologize, but the slides are online. And we cannot see that event. But the one below it, where I just call PowerShell, where it's running PowerShell version 5 on this system, that happens to be a Windows 10 system, we can see it run here. And then if you could actually see the event there, you would see that it saw that. You can't see the top one because it's running PowerShell version 2. So how do we detect this? And this is an awesome graphic with like RGB colors. It actually had like 16K colors. This is a Where's Waldo picture. Again, explaining your memes is not so interesting or exciting. But we have to figure out where Waldo is. And it's very difficult to figure out where Waldo is because we have an executable that's calling PowerShell that bypasses our standard traditional security visibility through our logs. So I ran procmon by sysinternals to look at what PS attack was doing. Well, there's a lot of .NET calls, .NET 2, PowerShell 1. And as I dug into it, and also with some help from Carlos Perez, realized that we could look for PowerShell on non-standard processes. So we can do get process and pipe it and look for the system management automation, because that is the DLL that's called by those executables to run PowerShell outside of PowerShell.exe. If we dig in a little bit more, we can see all of the modules that it's calling. So kernel 32, again, pretty interesting, but system management automation NI DLL. So we can run Windows 10 with an AMSI aware AV like Defender. And when we do that, what do we get? It doesn't work. When it's trying to load those modules and decrypt them and put them into memory, AMSI kicks it over to Defender, and Defender goes, no, that is not good code. We're not going to run that. Except remember I said Matt Graber tweeted out how bypass, and then Jared went ahead and integrated it into PS attack. So now it works again. So it's always this cat and mouse game, try to figure out how to defend against something, and then someone comes out with a better mouse or a better mousetrap. Or you get a cat, and then you have a cat running around, and then the cat's not good enough because then there's a rat, and then you need to get a snake, and then a snake's not good enough, you get a mongoose. Then you have a mongoose running around your house, which is not so great with kids, no matter what you heard about Rikki Tikki Tavi. And then you get like an eagle, and trust me, you cannot have them in the house at any point in time. And then it just goes on to this thing where you just keep escalating and it goes crazy, and I'm off topic. So how do we detect PS attack? So I looked into this and I saw that event 400 is one of those events that starts with the original earlier version of PowerShell, PowerShell version 2. And what we can look here is at the host name, the host engine, but we can look at the engine version, and it says 2.0, which means that this executable is calling PowerShell version 2, which is really weird because I have PowerShell 5 on there. So in Windows 10, we can actually uncheck a box and say, I don't want PowerShell 2 on my Windows 10 box, and it will remove it. We can do the same thing with 8.1. And so when I try to run PowerShell version 2, it goes, I don't know what you're talking about. And so once we uncheck that box here and say there's no more PowerShell version 2, and then we run PS attack and do all of this interesting activity, guess what? All the script block logging starts showing up again. So 4104 shows us what it's trying to do. 4100, 4103. We get the logs that we would normally get from this type of activity and that we're accustomed to. So how do we detect it? Well, we can look at event ID 800, which means that if you're not pulling the original PowerShell logs, you probably need to pull those in addition to your operational logs. We can look for those host applications, not a standard Microsoft tool. It's not going to be 100%, but it's something to look at. Because if it says PS attack, it's probably not PowerShell.exe. Version mismatch. System management automation being hosted in a non-standard process. If you're using a tool that's able to look at processes and what they're loading, this is a good way to identify that. And then the other thing is custom executables are executables. They can call Windows APIs directly. They can call .NET directly. They don't need to run PowerShell code. So the problem here isn't PowerShell. It's the fact that untrusted code is running on the system that belongs to someone who doesn't work for your organization. So how do we detect this? How do we improve our logging? How do we find the bad that's out there? Well, we use PowerShell module logging. We enable that. If you have PowerShell version 3 or 4 or 5, you can enable it. Through group policy, there's enhanced logging in version 5. And of course, you enhanced logging in version 4. Version 5 has some more compelling features. And we can go in and set this and basically say, we want to enable PowerShell module logging, and we want all modules, so log all of them for us, please. So we log all our all our PowerShell activity. And then we look for interesting things like .NET Web Client download, Invoke-Expression, encoded command, bits activity, etc. That's a good start, but I'm going to show you why, if this is how you're looking for PowerShell bad, we're missing a lot. So Invoke-Expression is pretty much, it's been referred to as the hacker's PowerShell commandlet, with good reason. Invoke-Expression is a way to take any text anywhere, pull it into PowerShell and say, this is code, execute it. Which means that we can just pipe code into it and invoke it, and PowerShell goes, okay, it's a script, I'll run it. So if you have execution policy set up to block scripts from running, All I have to do is pipe text from anywhere and say invoke expression that, and it'll run. .NET Web Client download, very popular. We've seen it in the real-world attack tools. There's also a way to use the IE.com object. There's a number of different .NET methods to do this as well. And there's actually PowerShell commandlets that allow you to pull code down from the internet. So there's a lot of different ways this can be done, not just .NET Web Client download. So how do we detect Invoke-Mimikatz? That's what we care about, right? We want to find the bad stuff that we know is out there. We look for, we can do it the antivirus way. Look for Mimikatz, general key, we invoke Mimikatz. But unfortunately, someone told the bad guys that there's this tool called search replace. And we can just take Mimikatz and replace it with kitty cats, and then we can't find these things anymore. The antivirus vendors haven't really figured this part out yet, but they're working on it. They've got teams of people working on it. So I went through and looked at the most popular PowerShell attack tools. And I know they're the most popular because I just went to the Empire, PowerShell Empire GitHub repository and looked at all the PowerShell attack tools that were there, opened them all up, went through and looked at all of them, and started pulling out function calls and figured out what all those were, and then just started putting them together and parsing them out. And these are the ones I came up with. So token privileges, system reflection, system runtime, token impersonate, token duplicate, token privileges, system reflection. These are the core components of these attack tools. This is how they work. They can't really obfuscate those asterisks, because if they do, then they won't work when they get called. Again, there's an asterisk on that, and I'll get back to that. Which is now PowerShell obfuscation. So PowerShell obfuscation up until recently meant that we did some stuff, we changed some things around, but it wasn't that difficult to see what it was. Until Invoke obfuscation was released by noted red teamer Daniel Bohannon at DerbyCon, and it's kind of changed the world of detecting bad PowerShell. It highlights the gaps in finding these offensive PowerShell code. How? Because basically it is a full tool. Daniel spent hundreds of hours on his research and on this tool. And basically Invoke obfuscation could take script block code or an actual script and obfuscate it to the level where my indicators don't work anymore. Most indicators don't work anymore. So what does this look like? That's a shame. So what?
Brightness is too bright.
Yeah, probably. Okay, so we'll look at this. Invoke expression, new object, net web client, download string, a bit.ly link, right? Oh, we look for this. We know what this is. We look for net web client. We look for invoke expression. We know this. We got it, right? Except this is what it looks like when you run it through invoke obfuscation. Yeah, my indicators don't work on that. Okay, but we have script block logging, so we're okay. We'll just pull it out of script block logging, right? It's a ampersand in the beginning and some quotes and some other stuff. Oh, man. It looks exactly the same in script block logging. This means that our tools need to evolve. We need to figure out a better way to find these things. Because it also looks like this if you run it through again. Now it's got brackets with numbers in it. I can't even, like, what is that? And it looks like that in the script block logging. That's the event. How am I supposed to find that as a blue teamer? So invoke obfuscation, I highly recommend everyone here check it out. Daniel's talk at DerbyCon was fantastic. The slides are online, the video's online. But download the tool. Take some scripts, obfuscate them, run them in your sim, see what you get out of it. Run it, and then send it to Splunk. Pull that data back. Because this is what Invoke-Mimikatz looks like. This is a function in Invoke-Mimikatz, right? One of my indicators is image NT, optional, HD64, magic, right? Okay, that we kind of need for that to work. This is what it looks like for invoke obfuscation. For those in the back or in the front, they can't see it. It's brackets with numbers in it. It's quotes, it's single quotes, double quotes, commas, ampersands. And it actually gets worse. Because this obfuscation bypasses antivirus, because the antivirus doesn't even know what it is. It's looking for those strings that it can't find anymore. So the top one is your standard Invoke-Mimikatz. The bottom one is an obfuscated version of Mimikatz that I just ran through invoke obfuscation, selected the defaults, and ran it once. And it ran. So then I decided to get creative. And I'm like, what about PowerView? So I took PowerView and ran it through invoke obfuscation. And I got this, which looks nothing like the PowerShell code that Will Harmjoy wrote. And then I ran it through again, And it looks like this, and I'm not even sure what to do with this. There's how many lines of code? I mean, Will, has your coding skills gotten that bad where you're just putting random numbers in brackets now? I don't even know. Like, this is what happens when you have obfuscation at a very high level against code that you normally would be able to detect and find. Invoke obfuscation removes comments. It removes white spaces. It removes typical things that antivirus vendors are looking for. If you're looking for PowerSploit by looking for @manifestation or @obscuresec, it doesn't work anymore. So what can we do as defenses? How do we get our gang of velociraptors lined up so we can actually stop this and get ourselves in a good place? Well, constrained PowerShell is not a panacea. We can deploy this just by setting an environmental variable, and those initial attack codes like Invoke-Mimikatz won't work. We can use group policy to deploy this. But it's not a panacea. It's not going to stop everything. There's a way to get around it. But in order for someone to get around it, they have to actually remove the constrained language mode. And if we're deploying this via group policy, it's going to reapply after a certain amount of time. And we know that this will stop a lot of these more advanced attack tools. Not everything, but quite a bit. So how do we find obfuscated evil? And this was like one of my big slides, and it's tough to see, so I'm sorry about that. I was chatting with Lee Holmes earlier this week, a senior dev on the PowerShell team, and he said he's been looking at obfuscated PowerShell code for a while, and he has a script that looks at the deviation, the standard deviation or distribution of characters in PowerShell code. So he pulled from PoshCode about 3,500 PowerShell scripts, ran this on them, and looked for things that were unusual. So typically, if everyone in here writes a PowerShell script, you're going to have different types of stuff that people are going to do, different techniques. But it's not going to look like a bunch of characters like on the right side, which is highly obfuscated, versus letters on the left side. And he also identified that if you look at the entropy of these characters in the distribution, the ones that are much more similar are the ones that are obfuscated. So we have some information to work off of. And so I put this together. Deploy PowerShell version 5 so we get script block logging. And look for lots of brackets. Figure out, work with your SIM vendor, work with Splunk, figure out how we can get that. So when our script block log gives us something crazy like that, it gets flagged. I don't know about you, but I don't code like this. I'm not data. Look for lots of quotes, single and double quotes, and ampersands and other things that are unusual. Random function names or many unusual characters. Or just special characters. Because in this one where we're looking here, the top one is actually a $sign. The next one is open curly brackets, close curly brackets. And pluses and equals. I don't code that way. I'm not that great of a coder, but I don't code that way. So this is my detection cheat sheet that I put out before, and I've updated with create delegate and AMC utils to detect some of the things that Matt Graber's been doing recently. But this is a good foundation. This will detect the things that people are not highly obfuscating, where they're not just throwing things against it to see what they get. So it's a good start, and we need to start. We can't just throw up our hands and go, I give up because that, right? We want to set up our layers of defenses. We want to make sure that what we're doing has impact. Any of the things that we're doing to defend our environment, to defend our network, should align to one of three buckets. Detect what's going on, mitigate it, or block it, prevent it. So we should hit one of those three. And I'm actually an advocate for going for detect as much as possible. If we can detect there's obfuscated code out there, where it's being run, what system it's being run, to me that's of much more value than a lot of times blocking that initial attack, because then we get more information about what's being done. Instead of having a block, never know about it, and then they do something else which we never ever see. So get PowerShell to a new modern version like PowerShell 5. There are some caveats with it. There's some application incompatibility, so be aware of that. Get those logs to your central logging system. Pull them from your workstations, your servers, your domain controllers. Know what and how PowerShell is being used. Use Windows Event Forwarding. It works very well in large organizations. Identify your PowerShell usage. You can use SCCM software metering or something like that. See who's spawning PowerShell.exe. It's still very much being used today. And you can leverage constrained language mode where possible. Great place for this is on shared servers like terminal servers. There's no reason for users to be running PowerShell doing special advanced functions like calling the Windows API. So this one's a little tricky. Code sign your PowerShell scripts that you're using for administration. If you're using PowerShell scripts for a schedule task and you're not code signing it, how do you know it hasn't been modified? How do you know that someone hasn't snuck something else in there? How often do you check these scripts? How often do you validate them? You have them all over the place, right? We all do. We write a script that works great, schedule task, it runs over here. But that's a perfect persistence method for an attacker. And of course, we need to limit our admin rights. We want to make sure that we're boiling it down to just this much and no more. And please reach out to your antivirus, your anti-malware, your anti-bad code vendor and ask them when they're going to support AMSI on Windows 10 because you want that. I think we all want that. Block Microsoft Office macros. In 2016, there's an option in the GPO to block all macros in files that originate from the internet. That'll solve 99% plus of your problems. And you shouldn't have too much user outrage about that. If at all possible, digitally sign any macros. I don't get into macros here. There's an appendix to the end of the slide deck because I couldn't get to it. The other thing is OLE packager is used by attackers to embed code, to embed an attachment into an email so that when the user runs it, it runs code even if macros are blocked. Will and I spoke about this and showed a demo at DerbyCon. And I actually did a post on AD Security yesterday about how to lock all this down on Windows workstations. And certainly look at application whitelisting. Figure out how to control your executables, your DLLs, what's being run on your systems. Because, yeah, it's great to control PowerShell, but not if anyone can download any executable and run it on any system they want. And at least what we can do is deploy AppLocker. Most organizations pretty much own it. Deploy AppLocker and blacklist those home directory, profile paths, C user locations. So the users can't run executable content that they just download that are there. So in summary, what's good for the admin is great for the attacker. We know that PowerShell can be leveraged from outside of the standard PowerShell executables. And securing that isn't straightforward. I mean, that's a lot of stuff, right? Invoke obfuscation, I mean, I don't have a good answer for it today, but that's how this industry works. That was released last month. And Daniel said that there's attackers using some of those techniques already. So we need logging, we need visibility, we need to better understand what's going on in organizations, how tools are being used. And we should look at version 5 to be that new baseline. Because attackers are using more than PowerShell. So look at PowerShell, but make sure your visibility covers the whole gamut. If you have Macs in your environment, guess what? Python has no logging whatsoever. There is no constrained logging mode for Python. Is Python installed on every Mac? Yes! So you need to layer your defenses, know what's going on, understand what's out there. And the slides, like I said, will be, are actually there right now on presentations.adsecurity.org. And thank you very much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Daniel, Jared, Jeffrey, Justin, Lee, Matt, Matthew, Will. Thank you very much. That's been my time. Thank you so much for yours.